Well, on behalf of Anne Marie DeChico, our president, I want to welcome everybody to our program series. For those who are new, we do this 10 months a year. We have 2 more. Next month will be Father Frank Donio. He'll be speaking about his great-grandfather Sabatino. And then his Uncle Sam, Joe Rodeo.
Yeah.
And then the final one will be Temple Bethel. So, so now time for thanks. I always want to thank Harry. Harry's the one behind the video machine there. And so that if you want to see any of them that we have had, or most of them, if you go onto the Historical Society of Hamilton and you follow down to YouTube, you will see that we have those. And that's really one of the great things about these programs, that they're going to be archived and for posterity. And so that is important to me, and I think everybody. Thanks to the Canoe Club people, and wherever the refreshments came from. And a little bit about our speaker for tonight. Goeffrey graduated from Hamilton in 2002, 4 years later from Loyola, and where he got involved initially into the medical software business, where he continues to work today. He lives in Maryland, and so now the toughest part of the program for me is all the introductions. Now anyway, so I forgot the most important part, is that my mother's sister, Marjorie Littlefield, married Nick Continisio, who is my uncle by marriage, and happened to be my best friend. And so I keep trying to convince the cousins that I'm an almost cousin, so I could get invited to the cousins' party. But it hasn't worked so far. All right, so I want to introduce some of the family. First is mother and father, Ruth, Continisio, Gibson, and Rich. Is that place? There's Rich. Okay. And from Lobby's family, we have Leah, and Nikki, and Nikki's son Dan is there, okay? And besides that, we have from Joe Continisio's family, Lucille, and I believe your husband is here. Husband's Bob.
Bob.
And her brother Joe.
And my son Paul.
Yeah. Okay. So Paul. All right. Very good. And did I miss Stu?
Yeah, he's on his way.
Okay. And then we have Bob and Barbara Shank. You probably read about Bob lately. He's going to be honored by Lions Club as a citizen of the year. Okay. Chamber of Commerce, that's right.
Let's go, Mike.
And then we have Billy Shank and his fiancee Stephanie and
my daughter Lachelle.
And daughter Lachelle. Okay. So with that, I think that we're ready to move on.
Wait a minute. Forgot Leah. Right?
No, I said Leah.
Oh, she did first.
You
Scares me when you stick up for me, all right?
You should be paying more attention. All right. So anyway, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker for tonight. A little bit about Jeff. That he was, I don't know if he's going to tell us or not, but he was given an award for writing the Continisio family history, and that included I think a trip to Italy, where he had the chance, he and his wife, to visit the Continisio family and so forth. He's a talented young man. We're glad to have him. Jeff Gibson.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
I want to thank you all for coming out to Hamilton Lake this evening to learn about the history of the Continisio family and their impact on the Hamilton community. We'll dive into all the family history, the family tree history later on in the presentation, but for those of you who I haven't had the pleasure to meet, I'm Jeff Gibson. I'm the grandson of Ralph Continisio, who was the second oldest sibling of the Continisios and was the oldest brother. I'm truly honored to be here tonight to share some interesting history and funny stories about the Continisio family. Now, I've always had a great interest in my family origins and my aunts and uncles. In my family origins, and I remember as a boy that I would love hearing the wonderful and interesting stories my aunts and uncles would always share. I often come back to town and bump into Mr. Parkhurst, whether it be at the barber shop or in Ferreira's or Casciano's or even the Presbyterian church after a Sunday service. And anytime we ran into each other, we'd always spend a few minutes sharing some of our favorite stories about the Continisios. I enjoyed our chat so much that I finally approached Mr. Parkhurst and asked him if he would be interested in sharing some of these wonderful memories with the town, and by writing up a Continisio story in his weekly column for the Hamilton Gazette. It certainly didn't take much persuading at all, as he was happy to take on the task, and a few months ago he wrote a beautiful article about the core values the Continisios lived by and the positive impact they made on our town. He then followed up with me through a phone call and told me he had another great idea in order to share their legacy. He said the Historical Society of Hamilton has a monthly speaker series where they dive into a variety of topics in family history, and he thought what better way to share the Continisio story than to make it a part of the Historical Society speaker series. So the idea sounded like a great one to me, and I told him I'd be happy to help in any way I could. And the next thing I knew, he sent out a list of dates and told me to pick one that worked best for my schedule. So at the time, I thought he just wanted me to make sure that I could attend as an audience member. And one thing led to another, and as you can see, I'm now officially your speaker for this evening. So let's go over a couple ground rules before we get started. First, all the stories I'm going to tell tonight and share are compiled from a variety of resources. Many of the resources are in this room, and it's funny because their recollections of their respective parents and mutual grandparents are somewhat similar, but they had some funny family stories, and I spoke to each cousin about them, and they'd all tell the same story, but it all had some like unique twist or turn where they put their own spin on it. And then they always cleared themselves of any of the blame, and they'd always like force that blame onto someone else within the family. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is for the next hour that we spend together, we'll probably just go by the moral of the story here, that we'll take the advice from Benjamin Franklin when he said, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. I obviously say that jokingly, but I am very happy this evening to be here, so I'd like to go ahead and get started. I've broken the story for this evening into three sections. First, we'll go we'll go back in time more than 100 years ago to talk about my great-grandparents, Achille Continisio and Accursia Bono. The second portion of the story is really going to focus on the family business, and we'll go into some of the details about how it was the lifeblood of the Continisio family in a way. Then we'll end with some fun stories and interesting facts about my grandfather's generation of siblings and their influence to our wonderful town of Hamilton. So my great-grandfather was Achille Continisio, and he was born in Naples in 1883. He came to America in 1900 at the age of 17. Now Achille had two brothers named Nicola and Francesco. And the way that the story was explained to me last summer during my visit to Naples to meet with my cousins who still live there, is that Achille was picked to go to America in 1900 instead of his two brothers because the family felt he was still young enough to travel to America and be successful. In other words, he wasn't married, he didn't have family, he didn't really have anything holding him back in Italy, and they just thought that he really had the drive and motivation that was needed to travel to America and be successful. Now, my first example of how these stories often find a way to get their unique spin is my grandfather always told that same story, but he told it differently. He'd say that, he'd refer to his father as Pop, and he'd say, they sent Pop over to America because he was the problem child in the family and his parents wanted to get rid of him. So, take it for what it's worth, but at any rate, he did arrive in New York City via Ellis Island in 1900, where he began his career as a tailor in New York City. Now, my great-grandmother, Accursia Bono, was born in 1889 in the small fishing village of Shaka, Sicily, and she also traveled to America via Ellis Island. She arrived in 1905 with her brother and sister. Now, Accursia was one of the very few women of her generation who could read and write in both English and Italian. So this allowed her to navigate quite well on her own in America, and she was hired as a seamstress in 1905 at the same factory where my great-grandfather was working as a tailor. And he was eventually promoted to factory foreman right around the time that the two of them had met. Now, as one of the versions of the story goes, and it happens to be the one that I prefer to tell, is that there was quite a bit of tension between Achille and Accursia's brother, Al Bono. Achille was trying to court my great-grandmother, but Al did, for whatever reason, didn't approve of him. And this was a big deal because since Accursia's parents were still back in Sicily, Achille needed final approval from her brother in order to marry. I'm not sure of all the details around the tension, but Achille finally won over Al Bono and was granted Al's permission to marry my great-grandmother. The slight problem with this proposal was that my great-grandmother's sister was falling in love with Achille. So when she learned that the two of them were going to get married, she supposedly became furious, and the sisters never really kept in touch much after that. Nevertheless, my great-grandparents married and moved from the Bronx to Philadelphia sometime around 1909 or 1910. So in that day and age, like many Italian-American families, as well as many Hamiltonians, the Continisios were Roman Catholic. However, there's a pretty interesting story about how they became Presbyterian. So during my great-grandparents' move to West Philadelphia, they were good friends with their parish priest at the time. And the priest would help the Italian-American families with their transition to America, and if they needed an advocate, he was always sure to be there to assist. And after a few years, this parish priest decided that he wanted to marry, so he left the Catholic Church. And around that same time, the Wanamaker family in Philadelphia was trying to convert local Roman Catholics to Presbyterians. So the parish priest who left the Catholic Church ended up resurfacing in the Philadelphia area as a Presbyterian minister. So my great-grandfather heard this news through a friend, and shortly after he attended a Sunday service, and he was so overjoyed to be reconnected with the minister who had helped the Continisio family so much with their transition to America, that he barged into the home that night and walked into the living room and called a family meeting. And he told all the kids that from that day forward, the Continisio family would convert and become Presbyterians, and that was the end of the story. So it was now the year 1920, and my great-grandfather had been a master tailor for a men's suit factory in Philadelphia for a number of years. I'm not positive, but I did do some research on my own, and it really seems that the only major men's suit factory in Philadelphia during that era was a company called H. Freeman & Son. And they're still one of the oldest tailored clothing companies in the United States today. At any rate, it was a huge accomplishment for someone to have the distinction of master tailor, since a very small percentage of tailors had been able to accomplish that feat. So right around that time, his best friend, who he worked with at the suit factory, was a gentleman by the name of Angelo Prestipino. And Angelo had informed my great-grandfather of a small town in New Jersey where there were many Italian-American immigrants. And does anyone happen to know the town that I'm referring to? So the town obviously is Hamilton, and Angelo knew that Achille was trying to move out of the Philadelphia area to find more space for his growing family. Angelo invited Achille to ride the train from Philadelphia to Hamilton to explore the small town. And once they arrived in Hamilton, they found a large piece of land near the train tracks that was for sale. Angelo and Achille decided to purchase the property and started a business together in 1922. Now, does anyone who is not a member of my family know the company that I might be referring to? The first answer right here, and you won a gift certificate to Casciano's Coffee Bar. The participation is going to be key this evening. So they found a large piece of land, and bring up a picture. This is, again, is my great-grandmom and great-grandfather on their 50th wedding anniversary party. And here is some photos of the early years. So in the bottom left, this is my grandfather, Ralph Continisio. We always call this his Al Capone picture. And in the top of the top of the screen there is the entire family. So you have my great-grandfather here, my great-grandmother's in the middle, Mary Continisio Bancary's on the left, and Jenny Continisio Shanks on the bottom right. And this is Ralph Continisio, and Joe is in the middle. And I think is that Nick on the right, Lobby on the right, and Nick on the left? And then in the bottom right-hand corner here is another famous picture. This was the horse picture that was in everybody's home. It was usually somewhere in the living room or on the front mantle. And I believe it's my grandfather in the front, and is it Joseph and Lobby on the horse there? Which now brings us to the C&P Coat Factory. So here's a picture of it. I don't know exactly the era, but the shop was started in 1922. So it was called C&P Coat Factory. They specialized in women's and children's coats. So for a while, Achille commuted by train each day from Philadelphia to Hamilton. And then eventually in 1925, the Continisio family moved to Hamilton, where they all really remained until the day that they died. The one exception, my grandfather Ralph did move a few miles down the street to Elwood, but for the story's sake, we'll say that they all stayed in Hamilton their lives. So I will end the presentation with more detailed information later on this evening about each one of the siblings. But my great-grandparents had a total of 7 children, although one died shortly after birth. His name was Mario. But out of the 6 that survived, there were a total of 4 boys and 2 girls. And all of them at one time or another worked for the family business at C&P Coat Factory. From oldest to youngest, the siblings were Mary, Ralph, Aurelio, whose nickname was Lobby, Joseph, Nicholas, and Jenny. So my great-grandparents really lived a pretty modest lifestyle. And one of the accomplishments they were most proud of was that they were always able to provide for their children. My great-grandmother dedicated her entire life to cooking in the kitchen and caring for her children. And one of the famous sayings my grandfather often reminded me of when he would kind of go, yeah, question?
Yeah, sorry. Where was the factory located?
So it was right on Egg Harbor Road. I guess this is Egg Harbor Road here, right? And back right up to the front.
That's Vine Street.
Vine Street
No, it's
there?
Egg Harbor Road, Egg Harbor Road, it's Vine Street corner.
Right. Now it's a vacant lot next to the Hamilton train station.
Next to the,
Yeah.
next to the.
Next to that abandoned gas station.
Yeah.
I got it.
Yeah.
That burnt down.
That picture had to be in the 50s.
Yeah. Yeah.
When they built that right on the property line. So when you walked out, you were on the property. And the building wasn't a complete square. The side on this side was longer than the side on the other side.
Well, they eyeballed it in those days.
Well, I worked there for years, a few years. And everybody, the front wall, that was parallel to the street, the back wall was parallel to the railroad tracks, but they weren't parallel. So the roof was kind of oddly shaped at because
Yeah.
It's hard to see it from that angle, but.
Right. So I'm going to take it one step back. My great-grandmother dedicated her life to cooking in the kitchen and caring for all 6 of her children. And when my grandfather used to remind me of different stories, he always loved to tell this one. And he said, that my great-grandmother would always say, a mother can take care of all her kids, but all her kids can't take care of one mother. And he always laughed and then would follow that story up by adding the fact that he was the one that would take care of after his mom as she got older. And he'd purposely say it in front of all the siblings, and they'd all start bickering, commotion, and argue about who was truly the one that would actually take care of Grandma Continisio. So back to C&P Coat Factory. All the Continisio brothers worked in C&P Coat Factory at one time or another. But Lobby was the one who eventually took over the business. The other brothers dabbled in the business at various lengths, but eventually they all decided that they wanted to start different careers. And my grandfather Ralph was probably the ringleader in this whole thing because he was the first one to leave the company, and he always told me when he looked back on it that it was the best move he ever made, but it upset the hell out of his father. So Achille would get, his father would get sore at him. And really would get sore at any of the boys when they left the business, and would even go to the extent of not speaking to them for short periods of time after they left. But I'd have to say though, looking back on all of it, that it probably really did work out all for the best. My grandfather ended up working with Atlantic City Electric for 44 years. He eventually retired as division manager, which was one of the highest ranks within the organization at the time. And Lobby eventually became the sole business owner of C&P Coat Factory, where he continued to succeed in the coat manufacturing business. When Joe left C&P, he became a teller at Hamilton Savings and Loan, which eventually became Empire Savings and Loan, and he actually rose all the way to the ranks to become president of the bank, and they really thrived under his leadership. And then last but not least, Nick was a partner in Bancari Construction when he left the factory. And for a number of years before eventually buying out, he was partners with his brother-in-law, Charlie Bancari, for a number of years, and then eventually bought him out when Charlie retired and took over Bancari Construction. So all in all, the boys really went on to be successful from both a career and a community service standpoint.
All the way to the right, that door with the window next to it, that was a store there, and Uncle Joe, I don't know how many years he worked there.
Yeah, we talked about that, yeah, my mom.
Yeah, thanks for ruining later on in the presentation. I spent about 32 hours talking to relatives, so I definitely have more information than I can share tonight. So if you ever want to do like a part 3, 4, 5 later on, we'd have to come back and do that. So now we established Lobby was the last man standing at C&P Coat Factory, and he really knew the business inside and out since he had worked there ever since he was a kid. Grandpop and Angelo were still co-owners, but Lobby was taking on more responsibility and being groomed to eventually take over as owner. So we're right around probably 1940 right now, and we're kind of in the thick of World War II. During this time is when the shop was thriving. It was really at its best. It was in its heyday. The shop was producing anywhere from 400 to 500 coats a day, and they had close to 50 employees. And that wasn't a small feat during the war. It was actually a big boost to the local Hamilton economy as well. So C&P Coat Factory is part of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which was established in 1900, and it was one of the largest labor unions in the United States. Now, the reason why I share this information is because what it meant to be in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union was that C&P was only authorized to make women's clothing, not men's. So you might be able to tell where I'm going with this story. We're in the thick of World War II. People who fought in World War II were all men. So C&P was only allowed to produce coats for women and children. So there's a big piece now, right, in the business. There's a big piece of that pie that was up for grabs, and the large market was to start manufacturing coats for the soldiers during the war. Now, I give you all this background because my great-grandfather, Achille, would often travel to New York City to meet with representatives of the workers' union as well as his material suppliers. And during one of his trips up to New York City, he was approached by one of his suppliers who offered him a joint business venture to get into supplying military uniforms for the government. And my grandfather always said it was a decision that could have made his father a multimillionaire, but he turned down the offer because he wouldn't dream of going behind the back of his longtime friend and business partner, Angelo Prestipino, just to make more money. And it was a great lesson, I think, that he taught all his children with that story, because it really taught all of them about loyalty. And the saying that they always would say is that you're only as good as your word. And and your word and your handshake built loyalty way better back then than any amount of money or a signed contract ever could. And I think they really all kind of followed that rule throughout their lives. So CMP was always successful in the sense that it supported the whole family at one time or another, but production really started to decline after the World War. In the 1950s, they were the first union in the United States to shift to a 35-hour work week. So that was unheard of at the time. I mean, you know, they were working from 8 to 4, and everyone else was putting in a 40-hour work week. So now in the 60s, Lobby's children started working there part-time in the summers, and then in the late 60s is when Angelo Precipitino actually ended up passing away. So shortly thereafter, in 1971, my great-grandfather, Achille Continisio, passed away as well. So a chapter at that point in time certainly had closed after the passing of Angelo and Achille, but Lobby was still loyal to the family business, and he took full ownership and started his own chapter. So during the 70s, the factory still provided a good quality of life for Lobby and his family, but times were changing. In the old days, the material was cut right on site at the factory on the first floor. It was then brought upstairs to be assembled. But in the 70s, the operations around assembly had to change in order to remain profitable. So the fabric was coming into the factory pre-cut before it ever arrived to the factory, and the total coat production really scaled back. So if you remember back in World War II, we're producing 400 or 500 coats a day. You know, now we're talking about 120 coats per day. You know, at the same time, the employee count, which was, you know, close to 50 during the war, had scaled back considerably as well. And we're talking 15, 20 workers at this point in time on average. So with a smaller staff, it was critical that everyone really came to work and came in prepared, because if an employee ever called out sick, it would really cripple production. And you know, if they lost 1 or 2 people on a particular day, you know, they go from 120 coats that day to only making 80. So it really had a spiral effect. So around this time was also when CMP started working with subcontractors in the area, and their primary client was a company called New York Girl Coat Company. By the late 70s, an Atlantic City company named Peerless also started purchasing coats from CMP, and then would in turn sell them to major department stores in the area. The labor to put a coat together in the 70s cost about $3.15, and the wholesale price would range anywhere from $15 to $20 depending on the quality of the material. So over time, though, larger competition continued to creep into the marketplace, and it was really hard for the brick and mortar shops like CMP to compete in the industry. So sadly, the factory did officially close its doors in 1983, but not without leaving a long-lasting legacy in the town of Hamilton. Now, at this time after the factory closed, it was rented out for a handful of years to some tenants who eventually, after renting it for a few years, had offered Uncle Lobby $75,000 for the building, but Lobby had to decline. He just didn't feel that it was a fair offer, and the tenants eventually moved out, and they moved to a building across the street and reestablished their business there. So now this left Uncle Lobby with a factory that was vacant for a couple years. And then in 1989, after the shop had been vacant for a couple years, the shop caught fire and it burned down. And I have some pictures of some of the footage from 1989 of a few different angle points of the shop catching fire. What was even more unfortunate, though, from this whole story was, since the property was vacant, Uncle Lobby couldn't insure the building. So not only did he lose out on $75,000 sale that he could have made a couple years earlier, but it cost him about $20,000 to level the building and clean up the remains from the lot. And to add one last piece of insult to injury, Nick shared with me that the shop burned down in January of 1989, and even though the property was vacant, Lobby still had to pay property taxes for the 1989 fiscal year. Uncle Lobby eventually either sold or donated, and maybe someone here would know the information, but he either sold or donated the land to the Historical Society of Hamilton, and the lot remains empty to this day and is part of the grounds at the historical Hamilton rail stop.
You said he sold it.
Sold it. All right, so now let's shift gears into the final portion of the Continisio story this evening. We're going to spend a little time talking about each of the siblings. I'm going to start from oldest to youngest and share some interesting facts and fun stories, starting with Mary Bankary. Here's another interesting photograph that I was going through. This is from 1972. It's the Kiwanis Club of Hamilton. And what you'll find throughout the presentation is every single one of the brothers was an integral part of Kiwanis. And there's a lot of names down here that I remember my grandfather sharing stories about. Nick Cashan was one that was really close to the family, especially Uncle Nick and Uncle Joe. And there was another fun fact that I wanted to share, and this is prize number 2 of this evening. Again, no one from the family is allowed to share, but does anyone know what all the brothers had in common in relation to Kiwanis throughout their tenure with the civic community?
All presidents.
They're all presidents at one
Yep.
time or another.
Yeah, you did. Oh, you won the prize. Thank you.
Also Bankary and
What's that?
Bankary and
Uncle Charlie, Uncle
Uncle
Bob.
Charlie.
Oh, okay, yeah. So we'll start with Mary Bankary. Aunt Mary was the oldest sibling in the family, and just before the family moved to Hamilton in 1925, Aunt Mary would actually spend a couple of summers in Hamilton with the Prestipinos, where she would work the fruit stand. And I believe the farm was out on Pine Road, but I'm not positive. At any rate, Aunt Mary was extremely close with the entire Wood family during her life, and Evelyn Wood in particular was her best friend throughout their entire lives. During her high school years, Grandpa Continisio would supposedly never allow her to date anyone. And anytime he thought she was up to something no good, he would find out where she was and he'd hide in the bushes and spy on her. After high school, though, Grandmom and Grandpops suddenly changed their tune. Uncle Charlie Bankary came into the picture, and the story goes that Uncle Charlie had his eye on her and would often see her running to the Hamilton train station to catch her train to Philadelphia for work. If my grandfather were in the room right now, he would add that Aunt Mary was always running to the train because she was always late for wherever she had to be. Anyhow, when Grandmom and Grandpa met Uncle Charlie, they really fell in love with him. Grandpa loved that he was older, he was more mature than guys Mary's age, and he was also 100% Italian. So, now the more that Uncle Charlie started hanging around Aunt Mary, the more family functions he started participating in. And on the top of the list of family functions as a Continisio were the infamous Sunday family dinners. The dinners would start right after church at Grandmom and Grandpop's and would often last 5 or 6 hours. And it was really a great tradition where all the siblings were able to bond and spend time together. Aunt Mary was also very close with Grandmom, and as Grandmom Continisio got older, Aunt Mary would go over to the house to help her pay the bills and maintain all the bookkeeping, even though Grandmom always insisted that she was still sharp enough to do all that stuff on her own. Aunt Mary also really loved servicing the town of Hamilton and the surrounding community. She was a gray lady during World War II, and there was a group of women that would drive down to Atlantic City, and during that time, all the Atlantic City boardwalk hotels would turn into rehab hospitals for the wounded soldiers. Aunt Mary would visit with these soldiers and help them write letters to their families, play cards with them, and make them feel appreciated. She was always interested in doing whatever she could to help others in need. And Aunt Mary was also always involved in the South Jersey Mental Health Association, and she participated in that organization as long as she could. She was an avid charity volunteer for the American Red Cross, a faithful member of the Hamilton Presbyterian Church and church choir, as well as an elder in the church. For those of you who knew Aunt Mary, she, like many of her siblings, always had a way with words. Many of the cousins still talk to this day about how all of them could have been comedians on stage. One of the best stories, though, in the Aunt Mary archives was when her and Uncle Charlie were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary in Florida. Now, her eldest daughter, Charlotte, gave me permission to tell this story this evening. So, they were, where am I here? So one of the best stories in the Aunt Mary archives was when her and Uncle Charlie were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary in Florida. All the Continisios made the trip to celebrate, like they do with any family function. And after a fun evening of eating, drinking, and dancing, it was time for Uncle Charlie and Aunt Mary to thank their guests. I'm sorry. It was time for Uncle Charlie and Aunt Mary to thank their guests for attending and leave one another with some words of wisdom for achieving 50 years of marriage. So when Uncle Charlie finished his speech, he handed the microphone to Aunt Mary, who took the opportunity to say, "Boy, Charlie, the first 49 years were wonderful, but this year has been absolute hell." It kind of shocked everybody, and Charlotte just said, that was always like the recollection that people had. Yeah, Aunt Mary just had a way with words, and sometimes didn't really think before she said anything.
Yeah, she didn't thought.
No one was really entirely sure of the reference point at the time, but it was a perfect example of the unpredictable sense of humor that all the Continisios had. Later in life, Aunt Mary had a bad hip that needed rehabilitation, and she would go to physical therapy often, and during one of her visits, she had to pass a test. The test was to see if she could put round pegs into a round hole. Now, first she had to do this exercise with her left hand, and then she had to do the exercise with her right hand. And after she was done doing it with her left hand and her right hand, she had to do this exercise with both of her hands. And when she was finished doing it all 3 times, you could tell that she became frustrated, and she didn't understand the meaning behind the exercise. She completed the test and looked at the nurse and asked, "Can I please go on to kindergarten now?" And what the heck does any of this have to do with my hip? So the next oldest Continisio in the family was my grandfather Ralph. And I have way too many stories of Pop to share them all tonight, but he really was a special person. His memories from childhood were happy ones, and he loved living in Philadelphia. He used to say that everything was convenient in Philadelphia. In order to get anywhere they wanted to go, all they had to do was hop on the trolley, and he always liked that. The rule of thumb as well when he was growing up in Philadelphia was, at that time, Grandpop was so busy working, and Grandmom Continisio certainly couldn't keep track of all 6 kids at once. So the rule of thumb was that you could go out and do absolutely anything you wanted throughout the day, as long as you made it home by dinner. And the caveat to that as well was that you always had to stop over at Fairmount Park to bring home fresh pails of spring water from the stream. And I always thought that was a funny story because it seems like fresh spring water was it's certainly a big deal in European cultures. When I went to Italy last summer, our first stop was Rome, and we were walking around, my wife and I are walking around Rome, and there's these spigots all over on maybe every other street corner, and it just looks like a faucet with water coming out. And we were with a tour guide, and she noticed that we were walking over to a stand to buy water, and she said, no, that's not what you do. You're in Rome. This is pure natural spring water. Just go get an empty bottle and fill it up, and you'll never have to buy water the rest of your trip here. And I never really connected the dots until that point in time. I said, that's probably how Grandmom and Grandpa felt when they would tell the kids to bring home that fresh spring water from Fairmount Park. Another funny story about the Continisio brothers was that everyone always referred to them as uncle, so even if they weren't related to them. So, for instance, my grandfather was known to many in the Kiwanis circle as Uncle Ralph and also as Mr. Kiwanis. And a local business owner talked to me a number of years ago about how everyone in Hamilton knew who my grandfather was if you were a small business owner in town. He said, your grandfather's the second person you meet when you open a business in Hamilton. The first is Mr. Aloisio, the building inspector. Right about the time that Mr. Aloisio walks out the door, in comes Uncle Ralph. He walks in like he owns the place, he looks you right in the eye, he sticks out his hand and he says, how you doing? I'm Ralph Continisio and I want to sign you up for Kiwanis. We meet on Tuesday night, so go home, talk it over with the old lady, and I'll be back later in the week to go over the details. But community service was really important to him, and he was very active in Kiwanis throughout his entire life. I even remember stories when he would spend the winters in Florida, and he often attended Kiwanis meetings there as well. And sometimes he would always say that he had to make sure he attended Kiwanis in Florida so that he could keep up his perfect attendance if it was within his sight for the year. Pop was also a member of the Southern New Jersey Development Council, the South Jersey Chamber of Commerce, the United Way of Atlantic, Camden, and Gloucester County, as well as the Executive Board of the Atlantic Area Council Boy Scouts of America, where he was the proud recipient of the Silver Beaver Award. Pop was also the inaugural recipient of the Nice Going Award, which is an annual award presented by the Hamilton Chamber of Commerce. And above all else, two things that Pop was most proud of was his family and his career at the Atlantic City Electric. One thing that I learned over time was that all the Continisios were really well respected in the community. One of the reasons why is they always tried their best to go the extra mile to help people. When my grandfather passed away in 2007, people approached me who I'd never even met before, and they talked about what an honorable man he was. These people shared the feel-good stories when times were tough. Families who remember not being able to pay their electric bill would walk up, they would come up and tell me that they remembered the hard times when their families couldn't scrounge up enough money to pay the electric bill, only to find out that my grandfather would pull whatever strings necessary to ensure that they weren't cut off in the dead of winter. There was no time limit to the generous offer either. It was just understood that when these families got back on their feet, they would eventually meet their financial obligations with my grandfather. There were no phone calls, there were no past due invoices or threats to cut off their electric. It was all done with a handshake, and that was the end of it. Those generous offerings were made by all the Continisios, though not just my grandfather. It was just who they were. It was what they believed, and they knew it was the right way to carry themselves in a town that they really did hold dear to their heart. Next up is Lobby, and I shared a lot of history on Uncle Lobby earlier in the presentation during his time at CMP Coat Factory, but he was also a special Hamiltonian who really made some positive impacts on the town ever since he was president of his high school class. Not only did he help employ dozens of Hamiltonians over the years when he was running the shop, but in the 40s he was on the town council and he even ran for mayor in the late 1960s. It was either 1968 or 1969. And of course, he was also a member of Kiwanis. Big surprise there. People always asked how he got the name Lobby, and my grandfather, for one, would used to answer that question without skipping a beat. He'd say, Lobby got his nickname because anytime anyone looked over at him, he was always sitting somewhere sleeping. And he said one time he even remembers when he would fall asleep at the dinner table, and somehow, supposedly, that's how he got his name, and it stuck. Uncle Lobby always had a love for sports, though, and was quite the athlete in high school. His favorite sport of all, though, was baseball. There are two stories that kind of reminds me of that I like to share, and they always stuck out to me about Uncle Lobby. The first is my memories of that entire generation coming over to our house for dinner certain times throughout the year when I was a kid. And now at this point in time, Uncle Lobby couldn't see too well. And I'll never forget that I had to describe, he was sitting next to me and I had to describe all the food that was on his plate because he couldn't quite make out what it was. And I say that because when we were done eating dinner, he was a huge baseball fan and the Phillies were on. And he said to me, hey, let's go in the living room and turn the ball game on. So we're sitting down at on the couch later that night, we're watching the Phillies play right after dinner, and when we're watching baseball, right, you're thinking, the difference between a ball and a strike is a matter of inches. And, sometimes people who have great vision might not be able to tell the difference between a ball and a strike. But, we'd be sitting there watching this game together, and I just always remember sitting next to him on that couch in my parents' living room. And after one of the pitches, he looked over at me and kind of hit me on the leg, and he said, "I think that ump needs to get some glasses because that pitch looked like a strike from here." Uncle Lobby also always loved math, and he was really good at it. He had experience keeping the books and processing the payroll for his company for a number of years, and math came very naturally to him. As a kid, I always remember needing to raise money for different sports teams. And I always felt like I had an advantage over all my friends because I had this strong network of uncles in town who were always going to chip in for whatever it was that I needed. So at any rate, I remember going over to Uncle Lobby's house to ask for a donation, and he gladly wrote me a check for my Hamilton Little League fundraiser. A couple of months later, he bumped into me at a family gathering and raised all kinds of hell with me and said that I was screwing up his checks and balances for his checkbook because I never cashed the check that he wrote me. So I tried to explain to him that, and when he says that, I'm thinking to myself that he's probably sitting there also thinking that I could kiss any future checks goodbye. So I did explain to him, though, that I had nothing to do with cashing the checks because he made the check out to the Hamilton Little League for a fundraiser. He didn't make it out to me personally. And then he kind of gave me a blank stare and he said, "Well, they better straighten up their act down there at the lake. Your Uncle Joe used to be president of the Hamilton Little League. Maybe it's about time he starts running the place again so they can get back to a smooth operation." So speaking of Uncle Joe, he was always a favorite of mine. He was so genuine, he was so funny, and he was just an all-around great human being. He spent his early career at C&P Coat Factory. He spent his early career at C&P Coat Factory, and he was a buyer for children's clothes, and he was also a cutter in the factory. He and my Aunt Kay even ran a retail store on the ground floor of the factory for quite some time. And besides being president of Hamilton Little League, Uncle Joe was also an elder in the Presbyterian Church, a longtime member of Kiwanis, and a U.S. Army lieutenant serving in the Cavalry Division as well as a pilot. He was married to my Aunt Kay for 49 years, and they truly were a great match. Over the years of Uncle Joe working at the factory, he realized that there wasn't really enough work to keep all the family employed full time. So in the late 50s, he decided to join the Hamilton Savings and Loan as a teller, which later became Empire Savings and Loan, and he eventually worked his way up to president. Uncle Joe was another perfect example of someone who consistently gave back to his community and tried to help families in need whenever necessary. To this day, many people still share their stories about how if it wasn't for Uncle Joe, they never would have been able to get a mortgage for their first home. When no one else would loan them money, Uncle Joe always found ways to extend his hand, and it really made a big impact to them. Uncle Joe was also known in many circles as the best pinochle player in Hamilton, and he always liked to be the dealer when the family would get together to play 7 1/2. He kept the family on their toes, and his wittiness and his funny stories were always ones to treasure. He kept his nieces happy by trying to spoil them as much as he could, although it was a tight race between him and Uncle Nick to see who was going to win that award. But one funny story about Uncle Joe was his ability. He always had that ability to make you laugh. And his grandson and my cousin, who's in the room tonight, Paul, always told a story that pretty much summed up Uncle Joe to a T. Uncle Joe was over at their house for dinner, and it was during a time when his eyesight was getting poor, and they were wrapping up with a fairly long meal, and my Aunt Lucille started to clear the dinner plates so she could make room at the table for dessert. And Uncle Joe noticed that there was a plate of something still sitting in front of him, so he turned to Paul and asked what it was. And Paul told him it was a plate of salad that he hadn't touched while eating his dinner. And without skipping a beat, Uncle Joe looked at him and said that he really disliked salad, and how about I give you $5 if you eat it for me? The youngest of the Continisio boys was Uncle Nick. And Uncle Nick never had kids, but he sure loved to spoil his nieces and nephews. Like Uncle Joe, Uncle Nick also served in the World War, but never talked about it much. And for that matter, Uncle Joe didn't really discuss it at all either. It was one of those things that the boys kept close to their chest. It was a tough time for them But you know, serving their country was something that they thought they had to go do. And Uncle Nick was thrown somewhere between the scenes in China, or I'm sorry, somewhere behind the scenes in China for a few years, and no one really heard from him much while he was over there. At any rate, when Uncle Nick finally made it back from the war, he never ate another grain of rice when he came back from China for the rest of the days that he lived. At least that's the story that Charlotte and Augusta both confirmed for me. Uncle Nick had all he could handle for a lifetime during his years in China. And neither Uncle Joe or Uncle Nick came back to the States thinking of themselves as heroes, though, when they came back from the war. You know, and quite frankly, it wasn't until last night that I actually found an article online of both Uncle Joe and Uncle Nick, where they were recognized on the World War II Honor Roll. I'm not even sure what that is, but it's an award that they never talked about because self-accomplishments weren't really important to them. Helping others and serving the community was what was important to them and to all the Continisios. Now, Uncle Nick was always known as the fastest runner in the family, and the brothers would always get a kick out of it when Uncle Nick would get in trouble because Grandpa Continisio would always try chasing around the house and he could never catch him in order to punish him because Uncle Nick was always too fast and got away. Uncle Nick was also the epitome of a service leader. Like every other brother in the family, he too was a member of Kiwanis, and he was also the president of the school board, which was pretty amusing because he had no kids. So it wasn't like he was doing it to have a skin in the game. Education was just something really important to Uncle Nick, and he wanted to make a difference in the town. I'm not sure if you know this or not, but Uncle Nick was an integral part of the fundraising and advocating for the Hamilton High School on Liberty Street. Towards the end of that project, the town found themselves backed into a corner while they were running over budget on the project. They weren't able to get, they weren't going to be able to open the school as planned until they raised enough money to finish some of the concrete and paving work that still needed to be completed out on Liberty, as well as the surrounding parking lots. And in typical Continisio fashion, Uncle Nick sent out his entire crew from Bankeri Construction to complete the remaining work on his own dime. Above all the stories, though, my favorite Uncle Nick story was his love and affection for his first wife, Aunt Margie Littlefield. The story goes that Uncle Nick had a crush on Aunt Margie from his Sunday school days as a child. When he came back from the service, she was living with a friend in New York City, and Augusta recalls that they were living, she put it that they were living like two glamour chicks in New York City. And Uncle Nick had saved up a bunch of money during the war and planned a weekend trip up to the Waldorf Astoria in New York City, where he tried to persuade Aunt Margie to marry him. And as thrilled as Aunt Margie was, she had diabetes at the time and told Uncle Nick that she couldn't marry him because she would never live long enough to make a great wife for him. And Uncle Nick responded by saying that he would dedicate his life to making each day they had together a happy one for as long as they lived. And the rest was history. They married and settled into Hamilton shortly thereafter. And last but not least, what better way to end tonight's presentation than to relive the wonderful memories with Aunt Jenny. Aunt Jenny was the youngest of the family, and I don't know that there was a single Hamiltonian during her lifetime that she didn't know. She was a staple in the community, especially with Kessler Hospital. Aunt Jenny was so proud to dedicate her time to Kessler and really make a difference in the town. She volunteered tens of thousands of hours at the hospital and always made new friends in the process. Aunt Jenny was also in charge of the hospital gift shop and did all the buying for the store. She was also extremely dedicated to the Women's Civic Club and was most proud of being crowned Peach Queen of Hamilton. What she will always be remembered for most, though, was her cooking, at least in my eyes anyway. Aunt Jenny could crank out food like nothing I've ever seen before in my life. She was one of those she was the one with all the cooking knowledge in the family, and that was mainly because she spent hours in the kitchen with her mother growing up. Her older siblings had already moved out of the house, and during her teenage years, she was really the only one left around the house. So she used that time to perfect her cooking skills in the kitchen with her mom. I always had a close bond with Aunt Jenny. In a way, she was kind of like the grandmother I never had. Both of my grandmothers passed away when, two of them passed away before I was even born, and when my grandfather remarried, my mom passed away when I was little. And Aunt Jenny she kind of filled that void for me. I remember going over to her house during my high school years, and that's probably when her and I really started to bond as well, because I was independent at that time from a standpoint that I had a driver's license. I could go over to her house and see her without needing a ride or having her come and pick me up. And she'd always, anytime I bumped into her in town, or she'd call me, and she'd always say, just let me know. You can come over for lunch whenever you want, and I'll sit here, and you have an interest in cooking, and I'll teach you some of my recipes. Well, as soon as I heard that, I was like over there all the time. So she always loved that I showed such an interest in cooking, and I'll tell you what, though, it was frustrating trying to get her to share her secret recipes. I finally learned the recipes through trial and error. I remember that she would have me over for lunch often, and she knew my favorite was her spaghetti and meatballs. I loved their sauce, and I loved the way she made the meatballs. And while we ate lunch together, I'd always quiz her and ask her for the list of ingredients in her sauce and the list of ingredients in her meatballs. And she was always notorious for always leaving out one key ingredient. So, first she'd tell me the story, and she forgot to tell me that she put garlic in the meatballs. But then, like, a couple weeks later, she'd tell the story again, and she forgot to put she forgot to tell me that she put onions in it. And then I think the last key thing, the last key ingredient I needed to complete the recipe was she used Lowry's seasoned salt. And over time she had forgotten. Each time she told me the recipe was something different, where eventually I put the recipe together. And I knew I nailed it because she came over to the house one time, and when she was over for a night for dinner, she had one taste of the sauce and meatballs I had made that evening, and I'll never forget, she gave me 2 thumbs up, and she said that I finally mastered her recipe. And Aunt Jenny also had a unique ability to be on top of all the latest and greatest breaking news about the town of Hamilton. My grandfather would often tease her, and it would really burn Aunt Jenny up when he teased her about always needing to find out the latest bit of information. I remember many times around the dinner table with my family and my grandfather when we were reminiscing about old stories, and somewhere along the line there was some mix-up or miscommunication, and where there was a piece of the story that was missing. I don't know if it was a person's name, or if it was the particular year that something happened, or the year someone died. And my grandfather at the end, it was usually my mom and my grandfather going back and forth to try to figure out what the correct piece of information was in the story. And my grandfather finally hit his hand down on the table. He said, "I don't know why we're arguing about this. Pick up the phone and call Jenny." And he'd say, "I guarantee you she knows the information, and if she doesn't, she'll make a few phone calls and she'll get back to you within an hour." And damn if when we actually did that, we'd laugh, because sometime that night the phone would start ringing, and she'd come back with a whole list of information and how everything fit into the story, and then she was the one that then would go retell the story. And it was just always really funny. So that's a little piece of great memories from the Continisio family. And my time and stories that I've told tonight really basically just barely scratched the surface. I guess I'll end with saying that what I was trying to convey, and what I hope I conveyed, was the Continisio family, they really were pillars in their community. They cared about Hamilton, they cared about their core values, which were their community, their family, and their God. And that's what motivated them. That's what ultimately defined their legacy on the town of Hamilton. So thanks for letting me share these stories with you this evening, and if anyone has any questions for me or for any of the relatives, be happy to discuss.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Then on next year, right, for part 2.